here with us today. Hey everybody, I'm Eric Waldo. I'm the Executive Director of Michelle Obama's Reach Higher initiative and also the Vice President for Access and Equity at the Common Application. So grateful and excited to be with you all today and really thrilled to have this conversation about equity in higher education. First, we'll hear from Jenny Ricard, the CEO of the Common Application, to talk about the change that is going on at Common App to remove the school discipline question from the Common Application. Then we'll be joined by former Secretaries of Education Arnie Duncan and John King to talk about why this decision is really important for equity in higher education overall. So before I turn it over to Jenny, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go ahead and get started. So hold on, everybody, and we will make this happen. Okay, and one more second. All right, let me turn it over to Jenny Ricard, the CEO of the Common Application. Jenny, take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Eric. You can go to the next slide. Before I head into some of our evolving the application work, and in particular a focus on our recent decision to remove the school discipline question from the common portion of the application, I wanted to give you some background on who we are. Who is the Common App? Well, we're a nonprofit membership association of colleges and universities with a shared commitment to the pursuit of access, equity, and integrity in the college admissions process. You can go to the next slide, Eric. We were started 45 years ago by an enterprising group of college admission deans and school counselors who had a great idea. They could streamline the college application process and reduce barriers for students by creating a common form that would incorporate questions, the most common questions from the applications, that other colleges' applications, and leverage the latest technology of the time, the photocopier. The idea was that students could handwrite or type in their answers to the questions, photocopy it, and then send it to the schools that they were interested in applying to. Go to the next slide. Since then, we've gone from 15 pioneering college members from across the country to more than 900 from all 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico, and more than 20 countries. And we've moved our technology from the photocopier to the cloud, yet we've retained that same mission of pursuing access, equity, and integrity in the college admissions process. Next slide, Eric. As part of our strategic vision to forge a direct, unambiguous path to a viable future for all students, 2 years ago, we joined forces with Reach Higher to help all students to be able to know that they have the right to and the opportunity to attend college. Reach Higher is the college access initiative started by former First Lady Michelle Obama during her time in the White House to inspire a college-going culture. So Reach Higher builds a college-going culture, and Common App helps students successfully get through the application process so that they can achieve their education dreams. I like to say that Reach Higher has provided Common App with the rocket fuel to achieve that mission of access, equity, and integrity. And Eric Waldo likes to say that Reach Higher needed a rocket. Together, we have liftoff, and we're able to make a much bigger impact on more students than either of us could do alone. Could you go to the next slide, Eric? And speaking of that impact, our 900 colleges and universities come from all over the country, all over the world. And the diversity of our membership, public and private members, is what gives us incredible diversity among our applicants. With more than 1 million students using the Common Application every year, a third of them are first-generation college and 46% are students of color. What these numbers don't show are the thousands of applicants and counselors that we support and the billions of social media impressions that we generate through our Reach Higher programming, such as College Signing Day, and School Counselor of the Year program. Since joining forces, Common App and Reach Higher have had a powerful impact already in terms of increasing equity of access to college. Can you go to the next slide? One example of that powerful combination has been the development of a robust equity data warehouse funded by the Gates Foundation to enable us to provide data analytics capabilities to support the higher education community and our access and equity agenda. The investment has enabled us to explore the application itself and how we, Common App, may be doing things that magnify inequities in the college admissions process. We all know that the process is difficult, even painful, for some students. So that's why we're turning the microscope on ourselves. How are we contributing to any difficulty that students might be having persisting through the application process? So we're reviewing all the questions on our application that may pose unnecessary barriers for students, particularly those students who may be most vulnerable in the process. With our community of college and university members, the school counseling community, and even our applicants, and grounded in data, we're working to ensure that all students can truly represent themselves in the application process, and that our members can receive the data and information that they need to make their admission decisions. We've been calling this project Evolving the Application because in the beginning of this initiative in March, we saw it as an evolution. But given the urgency we feel at this point in our country, from an access and equity perspective, we are now calling it a revolution. If you can go to the next slide, Eric. And yesterday, we were excited and proud to announce to our membership that we're starting that revolution by removing the school discipline question from the common portion of the application, as well as from the counselor report. And that's going to be effective for the 2021-22 cycle. Next slide, Eric. So why did we decide to do this? Why this particular change? Well, with our new data analytics capabilities, we looked at how students and counselors were responding to the school discipline question. And our findings added yet another perspective to federal data and academic research that had already existed, that had shined a light on the fact that school discipline disproportionately impacts students of color and Black students in particular. And here's what we found. We found that to begin with, just even without school discipline in mind, Native, Black, and Latinx applicants are least likely to submit their applications after starting them. So 75% of white students who start an application successfully submit it. That number is only 50% for Native students and 65% for Black and Latinx students. Can you go to the next slide? Just over 10 years ago, 14 years ago actually, in 2006, in a very well-intended move, Common App added the school discipline question to the common portion of the application. That had taken place after a review of all the different members' supplemental questions at that time, where the majority of them were asking that question. The idea was to actually reduce a barrier by having a student have to answer that question only once. And that's why we're doing this research now, to find out what were the implications of that. So the required question today asks about academic or behavioral misconduct that led to disciplinary action like probation, suspension, removal, dismissal, or expulsion from an institution, among other actions. If a student answers yes, they're required to explain the circumstances and reflect on what they learned from the experience. Can you go to the next slide, Eric? So what we found when taking a look at the implications of a student answering that question is that when you take a closer look at students who don't complete and submit their applications, you see that applicants who disclose school discipline are less likely to submit their application successfully. 22% of students who answered yes to the school discipline question did not submit their application, compared to 12% who said no. Can you go to the next slide? As I mentioned, there's vast research showing that there is a racial discipline gap in American schooling, and it has been persistent. According to the Center for Civil Rights Remedies study, suspension rates for Black students are almost 3.5 times higher than for white students. And within these different racial groups, suspension rates are even higher for students with disabilities. There are also studies showing that students of color are more likely to be suspended even when controlling for the type of incident. We wanted to see how this played out in the application process now that we have that capability. You can go to the next slide. What we found is that students who answer yes are disproportionately Black and Native. Common App data from the 2019-2020 application season confirmed that 24,000 applicants responded yes to the question, and we're able then to add some new perspective to the research. Black applicants are 2.4 times more likely to answer yes to the discipline question as their white counterparts. Adding to that, you can go to the next slide, Our data also confirm information that we know that Black females are nearly twice as likely than Black males to answer yes to the school discipline question, and over 3 times more likely than their white peers. You could go to the next slide, Eric. Common App on a school form that is typically completed by school counselors also asks whether a student has been subject to disciplinary action. It gives the counselor the option of saying yes, no, or that their school policy prevents disclosure of discipline. They can also leave that question blank. We wanted to understand that as well, and how counselors were responding to this question. Next slide, please. And what we found is out of 1 million applicants, counselors answered yes to the school discipline question for only 5,000 students. That compares to the 24,000 students who self-reported school discipline. We wanted to understand what made up that gap. Could you go to that next slide, Eric? And what we found was that 42% of school counselors don't answer neither yes nor no to the school discipline question. So taking a look at that gap, we found that 18% just leave the question blank, and 24% say that their school prevents disclosure of school discipline for a student. So we wanted to really understand the impact of that second category of counselors. Which students were most affected by that from a school policy that prevents disclosing school discipline? Next slide. And what we found is that students of color are least likely to attend schools that prevent discipline disclosure. White and Asian students were most likely to attend a school that doesn't disclose discipline, and Black and Latinx Native students were less likely to go to a school that prevents disclosure. So not only do we see huge disparities in discipline, but those disparities are exacerbated by the fact that Black, Latinx, and Native students who are more likely to be disciplined or have a disciplinary incident are more likely to go to a school that discloses that disciplinary incident. So that just compounding the impact of what's happening in schools in the college application process. So these clear inequities and the negative impact it has on too many students already disadvantaged by the system is why we're removing the question from both the application as well as the school forms. I think about the student who already thinks that the odds of college admission are stacked against them. And then they get to this question and they just give up. This change is for them and for our society so that those students don't give up and that they pursue the education that they deserve. If you go to the next slide, Eric. So we all know that the inequities in our educational system are much bigger than the college application process, not even limited to high school or college. It also includes all of K-12 and early childhood education. And while we've, as an organization, have evolved with technology since 1975, when you look at the content of the application, it has not really changed substantially. The application from 1975 and the PDF from 2020 are remarkably similar, even though the students applying today are not. So now is the time for us to reimagine the entire process. We're starting with reviewing with our members the questions that we ask in the near term already. And we'll be looking at, coming up, the citizenship question, gender expression, family, religious preference, and military discharge. Those were areas that when we reviewed with students, they felt that those were most creating barriers and discomfort for them in the process. The bigger opportunity for all of us is to reimagine the process as a whole with a student-centered equity lens. And Common App is ready to engage in that work, and we really invite you all to join us in that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Really appreciate you walking us through this exciting announcement yesterday from the Common App. I know now we are joined by Arne Duncan, the former U.S. Secretary of Education. We are also joined by John King, the other former U.S. Secretary of Education, who served during their time in the Obama administration. It was a privilege to serve with them. I know how important this issue is to all of you. And why don't I go ahead and start off with you, John? You have sort of a personal story about school discipline in your own background. I was hoping you might share with folks who are watching today about your experience with school discipline and how that maybe has informed your work both as a school leader and as the Secretary of Education.
Sure. Thanks, Eric. And thanks, Jenny, for your leadership on this issue. And always glad to join Arnie for these kinds of discussions. You know, I experienced exactly what Jenny was just describing in the presentation. I grew up in New York City. I grew up in Brooklyn. Both my parents were teachers, but they both passed away when I was a kid. My mom when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. And I was very blessed to have teachers in elementary school and middle school who gave me a sense of hope and possibility and made school a place that was safe and nurturing and supportive. But by the time I got to high school, like many young people who have experienced trauma, I was angry. I was angry at adults. I was angry at my parents. That may be irrational, but I was angry at the world. And I got in trouble. I got in a lot of trouble. So much trouble that I got kicked out of high school. I always say to folks that I'm the first U.S. Secretary of Education to have been kicked out of high school. And when I was kicked out of high school, I thought that was kind of the end of my aspirations about college, about career. Just thought like, oh, I've made these decisions at 15, 16 that ruined my life. And it was a couple family members and a school counselor who convinced me that I shouldn't give up, that I could actually go to college. And I did the college application process. And when I did it, I had to do 2 essays. I had to do the regular essay, and then there was a question about discipline. And I had to explain the story of my being kicked out. And I was very lucky that I had a counselor who convinced me, even when I saw that question, even when I was already discouraged about the college application process, she convinced me, keep going. And I worry a lot about young people who just don't have that. They have this sense that the deck is stacked against them. And so they see that question and they give up on the application process, or they lower their sights and they don't pursue a selective admission college because they figure they just won't get in. So I'm really grateful to Common App for acting on this issue. Certainly in the Obama administration, we were working hard on trying to get folks to reduce the use of exclusionary discipline with kids of color, trying to reduce the use of exclusionary discipline with students with disabilities, trying to get folks to create really a second chance society where we understand young people will make mistakes, but they ought to have a second chance and still have an opportunity to have a thriving adulthood. And I'm really grateful for this action today because I think there are young people who, because of Common App making this change, will now have a different trajectory in their lives. And that's hugely important.
Thank you, John. Arnie, you know how profound a difference these school discipline things can have for students, their interactions with the criminal justice system, throughout your work in Chicago. Can you talk a little bit about how you've seen this play out and why it's important for us to, unlock these opportunities?
I will, and if I can play Oprah for 1 second, just ask John, because it's such a profound story. I don't know anyone smarter, more empathetic, more thoughtful than John. I did not know him at 15 or 16, but I got to think he was that same person then. Rather than being kicked out of school, what would have helped you at that time when you were going through tremendous, turmoil and trauma at home? What would have been the right action other than saying you're on your own, kid?
It was really relationships. I needed that relationship with an adult, and I just didn't have it. After my parents passed, I lived with my brother. My brother drank a lot. He wasn't that much older than me. It didn't really work. And so I was just on my own. So, I needed that adult who would take the time to ask me how I was doing, to talk with me about life and choices, and talk with me about the things I've been through as a kid. When my father, it was just me and my father was sick with undiagnosed Alzheimer's. So home was this really scary and just painful and traumatic space for me. And I didn't have anyone to talk to about that. And so, I turned that into anger and following rules and disrespecting adults. So I needed that relationship. And I know that's so core to the work you're doing now, trying to help people find those relationships.
I'm trying to answer your question directly, Eric. You know some things coming to DC, and you were an amazing part of our team, and there are other things you learn. And I was aware of this school to prison pipeline. One of my tough early lessons when I started with the Chicago Public Schools is I went to go meet with a police chief and said, you're arresting too many of our young people, and I want you to stop arresting them. Let me work with them. And he said, let me look at the data, and I'll get back to you. I came back in 2 or 3 weeks later, and police have 3 shifts. It's 12 midnight to 8 in the morning, 8 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, and 4 in the afternoon to midnight. And his data showed that the vast majority of arrests of young people were 8 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon. Guess who was arresting them? It was us. It was our schools who were calling the police, and the police were coming to our schools to arrest kids. I remember that day like yesterday. It was the biggest punch in the gut. I went in there, want to go after him, and it was all on us. So we had a massive look at our data, massive retraining. It was fascinating. We had schools literally were 4 or 5 blocks from each other, south and west side, same socioeconomic issues, same challenges, same whatever. Some schools would have 0 arrests per year. We'd have other schools with 100 arrests a year. There are only 180 school days in the school year. So it's basically every other day that police are being called to arrest somebody. And so we were able to drive those numbers down pretty substantially, but that was very, very real. Where I didn't know, Eric, so I knew that part. Where I didn't know coming to DC was when we did the Civil Rights Data Collection Project. Catherine Lehman did amazing work there. And then finding out that the school to prison pipeline didn't start in high school and middle school, that across the country we were suspending and expelling 3- and 4-year-olds. And that was a similar, just total gut punch. And of course, we know who was disproportionately being suspended and expelled was our young boys of color, our young Black and brown boys. And again, for the life of me, I simply can't imagine what a 3- or 4-year-old can do to make you decide they should be on the streets. Yes, there are challenges. Yes, there are issues. Yes, we got to figure out what's going on. But again, we in education have to own these things and have to be willing to challenge the status quo that young literally starts a pipeline to incarceration down the road.
Thank you, Arnie. I think, it's fascinating to hear this. Obviously, you and John have lived this your entire careers. And Jenny, you've spent most of your career in the higher ed space. So there are some folks who come through that K-12 system that may have that bias, that does have that bias that's hurting our Black and brown students. People may not be as familiar with Common App weighing into an issue like this. Can you just tell us a little bit about, how the organization has evolved and why you thought it was really important to take this step?
Yeah, certainly. I would say, when you look at higher ed and you look at our membership and the system that we have, Common App is a part of that system that we need to fix. And when we joined forces, when we did our strategic plan a few years ago to really focus on how do we make this direct path for students? How do we remove obstacles for all students? Joining forces with Reach Higher was critically important. Your rocket fuel for the rocket was really bringing some policy experience and expertise, as well as being able to work with the Gates Foundation to get data about how students are interacting with the application. So I can say that every admissions person feels they manage the school discipline question very fairly. They don't feel they are biased in that process, but they're looking at it at one institution and don't have a sense of the scale of what the challenges are. When you look at the Common App data, and we had 24,000 students reporting yes, how many thousands didn't even get to Common App because they had a disciplinary infraction? And then we know how many didn't submit, but it's thinking about the impact that one question has. People in their own institutions, in their own worlds, see that they're managing it in a way that makes sense for their institution. But when you put it on a large scale, it's really damaging to so many students. And So that's how we got into this. That's how it was the combination of Reach Higher and Common App being able to advance the thinking about some of these questions and help our members really understand the implications of some of the practices that we've had for years and years and years, and what impact that's having on our most vulnerable students and the students we very much want to have succeed in post-secondary education.
John, I'm curious, because now thinking about the attention on institutes of higher education, Jenny's talking about, of course, people often are just in their own bubble thinking about their incoming class. You were the Secretary of Education. You also have been a leader in higher ed in New York, or in education in New York. And I know where you work now at Education Trust, you guys are incredible advocates for equity across the spectrum. We're at this moment of reckoning around racism in our country. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, too many others, and you see a lot of institutions maybe coming out with a Black Lives Matter statement. How do we make sure that institutions are living those values at moments like these?
Yeah, it's such an important question, because what happened in the weeks after the murder of George had all these institutions putting out statements of solidarity with Black Lives Matter and with the protesters, and promising to take on systemic racism. But I worry a lot about the gap between rhetoric and reality. We did a study at Ed Trust of the 101 most selective public colleges around the country. And what we found in state after state was that Black and Latino students were significantly underrepresented in those institutions. And in fact, in a majority of the cases, they are serving a lower percentage of Black students today than they were 20 years ago. You cannot reconcile that with the statements of solidarity with Black Lives Matter. You cannot reconcile the lack of faculty of color on higher ed campuses with the statement Black Lives Matter. You cannot reconcile hostile campus climate for students of color with those statements. And so they have, as a collective, I think, higher ed institutions have work to do to make real that promise of commitment to equity. One of the ways they can do that is by following the Common App's lead here and not adding this question on their own. Because one of the key decision points here for institutions, as you know, Eric, and as Jenny knows, institutions can always add additional questions. So even as Common App takes this important step, I worry that institutions will, almost out of kind of the sort of tendency to just stick with the status quo, keep doing what you've always done, they'll bring that question back. The Common App has also taken important steps around the criminal background issue. Right, but we know that there are institutions that have put an additional question on so that they can continue to create obstacles for students coming to their campus. That is a problem. We've got to make sure that we don't have these arbitrary barriers in the way of student success. And if institutions are serious about their commitment to racial equity, they have to be serious in their commitment to second chances for students who may have made mistakes in the past.
Arnie, sort of similar question for you. There's so much, as you know, the difference between regulation at the federal level for K-12, something like ESPA, No Child Left Behind, where we really are trying to make sure that we're getting the return on investment for our investment. You sat also in the Department of Education. We don't have that level of regulation through the Higher Education Act. How can we, we have our bully pulpit, we can talk about courage, but how do we put better incentives for higher ed leaders to continue to walk the walk on social justice and racial equity?
Well, one way that we absolutely failed to get done for a whole host of reasons is we know 100% of funding for higher ed is based upon inputs on enrollment, and 0% of funding for higher ed is based upon outcomes, graduation rates. And again, statements, whatever, statements are cool, I get it, but if you're talking about actions and outcomes, it's, do you have more young people of color? Do you have more Pell Grant recipients walking across that stage at the back end? And if just a little bit of federal money went to those places that were doing a good job of helping those first generation college goers or Pell Grant recipients or immigrant students or English language learners, whatever, helping them graduate, that would be a game changer. And for me, it's always, we sort of use the Olympic diving analogy that there's a degree of difficulty that's different. Harvard is always going to have a 97, 98, 99% graduation rate. Yes, they do a great job, but they got, students with a lot of advantage, a lot of privilege walking in the front door. If you talk about a community college or a commuter school or HBCU, where 70–80% of students might be Pell Grant recipients or first-generation college goers, are they making progress? Are they getting better at having them graduate? And ultimately, I want a lot more young people going to universities like that, and frankly, not going to places where they don't take it seriously. When I led Chicago Public Schools, we have a lot of colleges here in Chicago, as you know. We looked at the data. We had students with identical GPAs, identical test scores, wildly different outcomes, historical outcomes at different colleges. And frankly, we started to steer young people away from certain colleges here in Chicago and towards others. But the federal government just had a little, again, just carrots, no, just incentives, no sticks, just a little bit of funding based upon outcomes. That would be the game changer.
Jenny, you talked a little bit about this school discipline announcement. It's the beginning, and how I appreciate the photo of the photocopier, right? Of like how little higher ed is innovated. It used to be a photocopier, now it's backed up on a cloud, but it's still the same question. This is one question that we've discovered that is causing, keeping barriers up that we're trying to take down. You flagged a few others. Where do you see the evolution of the application going? And do you think it'll be equity based?
I think it must be. And I think that's what we all need to do collectively, is really think about the student experience and basically start over, with a new, we have a new generation of students. We have a completely different world, a completely different higher education system. And we've just been using the same structures to just put people through the system. And so I see the next big step is really working, with our membership, with the counseling community, with policymakers, with others, to really reimagine the effort. We're starting with school discipline in a way because we have the information. We also, I just want to give a nod to John for all the research and the work you're doing at Ed Trust, to really shine a light on this, because that information, it's out there, but people have not necessarily related it to their own work in an admission office. And I think that's made a huge difference for us. But our next step is thinking about citizenship, these questions that we have, and how does that impact undocumented students? And the family section, that's all about, more geared towards a nuclear family. There are a host of questions that we're asking. We're also seeing that standardized test scores are being used differently now. So what implications does that have for the college admissions process? And it's an opportunity for us at this moment to seize the opportunity to really reimagine the process with that equity lens and with a student focus.
Jenny, we're going to now have some questions coming in through the chat that I'll bring to the panel here. And that's actually a great transition to one of them, which is asking, given how so many schools are going ACT, SAT test optional, how do you think that will affect the application process overall, and actually how will that affect admissions equity going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. We actually have some research, some early research that a team of researchers working with Angela Duckworth looked at the common application from data, just from the application itself, to try to predict graduation for students, successfully predict that in college. And what they found was that just using machine learning and data from the admission application, they could predict 73% accurately a student's persistence in college. So you start thinking about all the different factors that about students in terms of their resilience, teamwork, innovation, what they've overcome. And that's one of the things that we think about. Is it better to look at achievement, what people have achieved, or actually how far they've come in terms of what they've overcome to achieve what they've achieved? And so there are lots of different things, I think, to think about, and there are lots of different movements, and it's going to take, I think, a lot of us working together from different perspectives to have the perspective of the student and their success in mind to change that. But admissions offices are going to be figuring out ways to predict success because they want the students to succeed in their institutions.
Can I add something quickly to that?
Please.
I want to flag a worry that there are some folks who are saying that that they're going to test optional and that that's going to automatically produce a significantly more racially and socioeconomically diverse student population. And I worry that that is too narrow an analysis of the admissions process. If they aren't recruiting at high schools with large numbers of low-income students and students of color, if they aren't changing their financial aid policies to make it possible for low-income students to attend their institution, I think about what Franklin and Marshall did under Dan Porterfield, where they shifted dollars away from quote unquote merit aid towards need-based aid in order to dramatically increase their Pell population. If institutions aren't using affirmative action and weighing race in their decision-making process, if they aren't making these other adjustments, if they aren't diversifying their faculty so that students of color see themselves in the faculty and want to be on that campus, if they aren't making those other policy changes, test optional alone, I fear, will not be enough to make a difference on the core question of our institutions serving a diverse population.
That's a great point, John. And I think, another question coming in here in the chat. I'll just talk about the systemic issues in the broader sort of federal and sort of police state issues. And Arnie, maybe I'll direct this to you, given the work that you've done with Chicago Cred and also given your work, sort of cross-agency work at the Department of Education. One of the questions asked about, the reality, we're talking about one slice of systemic disparities. And, the questioner asked, is there a strategy to think about how to work with other policymakers, other agencies like DHS, and other powers for folks who are having that dramatic impact on children and putting them in sort of the school to prison pipeline?
Yeah, I mean, we have to. So you go right down, feeding kids is really important. In some schools, 3 meals a day. As you know, Eric, that wasn't us. That was the Department of Agriculture. How we get kids off to a good start. That's often, that early childhood is so critically important. Childcare. That's not us largely. That's HHS. You can go right down the list. All the work we tried to do around better funding of community colleges and sparking innovation there. That was Department of Labor, not us. To try and solve any of these things in a silo is impossible. And not that, cross-agency collaboration is ever easy and takes some time, but where we were able to do that well and thoughtfully, the impact is exponentially higher. So that, if you're trying to solve anything, there's no one easy answer. You have to be able to cut through bureaucracies and figure out together how you get resources to the kids and communities and schools that need them the most.
I think we're always in this as we hit down to the last 5 minutes of our panel, I wanted to address this question because I also think while we're talking about removing a barrier like school discipline, which is critical, we are talking about systemic bias and challenges. And I think this is one thing that we hope will make it easier or more likely that a student who maybe wasn't considering applying to college to apply. And John, you talked about having that great school counselor and how important that is. And I think a lot about the question that's constantly debated in higher ed, sort of the is college worth it question. And I always think that stuck within that question is bias that for some kids, people are saying, when they say it's not for everybody, they mean for Black and brown kids, for poor kids, for kids who don't look like them. I just wonder actually if each of you could sort of talk about how you answer the sort of is college worth it question. And I'll start with you, Jenny.
Yeah, well, college is absolutely the best investment that someone can make in their future. Studies, everything shows that someone who's persisted and graduated from college tends to earn more over their lifetime, also tends to be happier. It is absolutely an incredible investment, and the fact that people would say that it's not worth it is inaccurate. So that's what I would say.
John, how do you respond to these people? Because again, it frustrates me. I'm curious, what do you tell those folks?
Yeah, I mean, well, your framing is exactly right? When they say that, it's rarely about their own kids, or themselves, right? It's about somebody else, and often that is around race and income. But what I try to tell young people is, you want to have the most options in life. And the person who has a college degree is going to have more options, going to have more career options. That could be an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree, but they're going to have more options around career, around where they live. They're going to have more choices. They're going to have more income, as Jenny described, and that's going to give them more choices. And they're going to be, I hope, better prepared to fully engage in our civic life. I think we sometimes focus on the economic benefit of college and leave aside find that actually another part of college is preparing you to be a critical consumer of media, to ask the right questions of your elected officials, to advocate for the things you care about, for the social justice priorities that you have. So hopefully there's a way that young people can see college as not only a personal benefit, but empowering so that they can contribute even more to their community.
All right, I'm going to do my best MSNBC, Arnie. We have 2 minutes. We're going to give you the final word. How do we talk about is college worth it, even during COVID times, during all times?
Yeah, well, I think I'll just echo and say amen to Jenny and John. I mean, Jenny can walk you through all the data. John can talk about how this is always, people argue about this for other people's children, not for their own. I'll just say, working with a set of young men now, the vast majority of whom have dropped out of high school, none of whom obviously have any college experience. We've had well over 100 guys graduate from high school. We have 2 cohorts in college now. There's not a single person who has been on the other side of the fence who is happy with that, who feels that they had the opportunities they wanted, and feels that like society supported them. And so the only time I hear people saying this isn't good enough, it's frankly, it's the elite, it's the privileged. And those who have been denied those opportunities understand way better than any of us here how valuable those are. And all I can say is they are fighting with everything, every fiber of their body to create those opportunities for themselves now, often late in the game, because they know way better than us how critically important it is.
Well, I think everyone who's watching ASU GSV at home, just please join me in thanking Jenny Ricard, the CEO of Common App, John King, the CEO of Education Trust, Arnie Duncan, Managing Partner, Emerson Collective. This has been an amazing conversation. I think we all know that this is just one step trying to achieve more equity in higher education, but we couldn't get where we are without each of your leadership and your collective contribution to helping more students achieve their dreams. So I just really appreciate each and every one of you for your leadership, your courage, and what you've done to try to fight for more students and what they believe in. So thank you, guys.
Congratulations to Jenny. Great work. Great work.
Thank you.
Thank you,
all.
guys.
Thanks.
We really appreciate it. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, guys. Really appreciate it.